Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Once again, we're remote, dealing with the same challenges that everybody's dealing with in keeping our distance and dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. We hope to continue to bring you relevant topics that'll help you get through the crisis, or at least provide some guidance. And today certainly is no exception. We're going to be talking about the especially sensitive area of compensation. And this is going to be a two-part series. We're going to try and talk about executive compensation in part one, and then a separate show we'll talk about director compensation. So joining me is our compensation expert on the show. Please welcome Bob Romanchek, who's a partner and senior consultant with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Bob.
Yes, thank you, TK. Pleased to be here.
So part one is compensation committee challenges with the executive compensation during the COVID-19 crisis. And Bob, I think, first of all, obviously all hell has broken loose with respect to goals and targets and everything that was set. Typically, that occurs when the budget, and probably occurred most likely in February, okay? And so all this was in place before anybody knew that the year was going to be turned upside down. So that certainly has affected stability, and plus an unpredictable future only makes it worse. But what I'd like to start with today is for you to take us into the compensation committees. I'm sure it's a very busy time knowing all that's happening and coming up to annual meetings. But take us in and go through some of the discussions that are occurring in compensation committees today, especially around the virus environment.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, think about that. About 30, 40 days ago, the world was a different place. And of course, executive compensation has been extremely impacted by that. So you're right. For calendar year end companies, most organizations during their comp committee sessions in the February timeframe set pay for 2020. Meaning base salaries, if there are adjustments or promotions or merit increases, may already have been in effect at that time, going back retro to January 1st even. Target bonus opportunities were established for 2020, not just value, but the underlying performance goals. And I do want to talk in a little bit more detail about that. And of course, long-term incentive grants were made at that same time, typically at the end of February. And of course, share prices could be half what they were in February as we currently speak. So that's going to have a major impact going forward. But stepping back, so what the boards, they're in a situation where they really need to implement almost guiding principles to really consider the impact of the financial downfall here on all company stakeholders, not just the executives. So that includes all employees, shareholders, supply chain members, consumers, the community at whole. The media is all over this. So the board is really being put in the spotlight here to take the right actions and make sure that they too are aligned with what's happening with the organization and sending the right messaging internally and externally. And I can tell you up front, the use of discretion is going to be critical in this calendar year. And in past years, particularly more recently, use of discretion by some of the proxy advisory firms, maybe some larger shareholders, was something that they were really not akin to. This year, not only is discretion going to need to be utilized, even those proxy advisory firms, as we get into this time next year, when they're looking at 2020 compensation, they're going to have to use a case-by-case analysis and allow for some of that discretion. But so let me go back with base salaries. What's happening? If you look at the executive population, so many organizations, and it's pushing about 500 now. You think we've got about, I'd say 8,000 public companies, not pink sheets out there. We've got about 500 that have either publicly announced or internally announced changes to executive compensation, and that's cut back. So do understand, this is not every public company. It is a subset, and it's those that really are impacted by what's happening economically. In particular, if you look at the specialty realty or realtors, oil and gas, restaurant, hotels, obvious industries where there are shutdowns, layoffs, furloughs. In these situations, the executives and board members are obligated to really look at pay and make sure they too are aligned in that respect. So if you look at base pay, this is where the change most typically is occurring. And if you look at the organizations, the close to 400 that have publicly announced this, the most typical base pay reduction is about 50% of base salary, which really amounts to, for the rest of the year, a little bit more, no base salary for your CEO. It is tiered. You go to the next tier, CFO, maybe at larger business units, it might be 25% of base salary being cut back, but that has become pretty standard bogey for those positions for companies cutting. Merit increases typically are not implemented, even though prior approved. Those are taken back. Promotions are frozen. But base salary, that's where a great preponderance of the cutbacks are occurring. You switch and you look at the target bonus opportunity, this is probably the area that is most problematic. And why is that? Well, again, in February, if you set goals already, targets and performance goals, just a short amount of time later here, and for many organizations, hitting those goals for the full year is going to be impossible. So what do? It is too early to take corrective action. And there's an exception or two to that. But in most cases, thinking how quickly performance decreased, things could go back up relatively quickly, at least by the end of the year. So we're hoping and thinking by the end of the year, things won't be quite as dire. Yet clearly, certain organizations right now know they're not going to hit the minimum payout levels. And in those cases, still, the thought is to don't do anything rash. Take your time, hold on. Survey the ground here and give it a little bit of time before you make a decision. So if you readjust now, 30, 90 days from now, the world could be a completely different place and you're going to have to adjust again. So at this point, wait and see is the most common approach, except if performance is so bad and you have no revenues coming in, no way you're going to hit the goal. Some organizations have decided to actually formally announce that they're just simply canceling the bonus plan for the year. And there are other ramifications to that as well, but it is a limited group that are doing that.
So just let me be clear. So if a compensation committee asks you, because I would have to believe that this is being a big question in a lot of people's minds, if a compensation committee asks you, what should we do with respect to setting new targets and issuing options and shares, particularly at this lower price, which may not look very good visually, to proxy advisors and some of their investors. Your recommendation then is to sort of hold off and let some stability of the future happen before you sort of step forward and make any solid plans?
Right. So now that you've jumped to the third category, long-term incentives, and there are a few different issues depending on what you're talking about. So grants, the long-term cycle, again, in end of February for calendar year companies, most calendar companies just made long-term incentive grants in February. And either those are time-based vesting, meaning it's very often a 3-year ratable vesting on stock options and or restricted stock units. Nobody should be taking action there. You've got 3 years for that to play out, and there's no performance goal. So it's basically stock price, and the fact that your stock price has gone down in alignment with shareholders, there's nothing really to adjust there. So for the grants that just happened that are time-based vesting, stand back, do nothing, you've got time. However, as we all know now, the push to performance-based pay for pay and performance alignment, performance shares where you've got not just a 3-year typical cycle, you have very specific goals, oftentimes relative TSR, in conjunction with an internal GAAP type measure, EPS, EBITDA, a return measure, depending on the capital intensity of your environment. So you just set a 3-year financial goal, just a handful of months into it, the performance is so negative, there's a chance that there's no ability to catch up even over the remaining 2.5-year period. But you do have 3 years. So similar to the annual bonus, here you've got even more time. And so in most cases, it does not make sense to go in and adjust any of those goals. Wait and see. As we get into the year end, you'll have a much better picture, hopefully, and more visibility going forward for the remaining 2 years. So that's easy to say. The grants you just made don't do anything. The difficulty really is in grants that you made 2 and 3 years ago, where 2020 could be the last year of a 3-year performance period. And given the negative performance, you could have gone from having an above target projected payout to below minimum, meaning a zero. That's the case where the committee, the comp committee, is going to have to come in, consider the facts and circumstances, and make a determination whether either you make adjustments to the performance goals to try to take into consideration the impact of the COVID-19, or you simply use discretion to determine, looking back, what would be fair, reasonable, logical in this case, understanding what shareholders and employees and others have experienced during the period. So it's really the look back to the open cycles that are going to end in 2020 or even 2021, where you've got this huge negative anchor acting on the 3-year performance goal. And I think that's where the most difficult questions are going to lie with the long-term incentive program.
So, Bob, I want to add just some considerations to what you've said. The first makes me happy, and that's the discretion. 2 years ago, we had, seems like literally no discretion on the compensation committee's part. And the reins have been loosened somewhat last year and certainly are going to be loosened this year. So that's a big deal. From a guidance perspective, I want to make sure that everybody's documenting the types of discussions they're having around executive compensation, because in the event that there's some kind of suit, depending on what's happened, it's very important to have a good documentation of the kinds of conversations that went on, so that if somebody tries to challenge, the business judgment rule sort of comes into effect. You can make a bad decision if you were good in researching and thought through the topic, but without having good documentation of that, then the business judgment rule can't kick in and sort of take you off the hook. Right. The other thing, which I'm sure you'll confirm, is that disclosure. This is not so much this annual meeting, but in the next proxy, there's going to have to be some great stories told about how you approached compensation for 2020. So that's another thing that you can start thinking about from a disclosure. And then my last consideration is insider trading. There is, without a doubt, information that's coming available to executives that is not available to the public. And for anybody to be venturing into selling or buying their stock, except in a very clean 10b5-1 plan, everybody should be cautious. We've seen this with some senators lately, and I think there is certainly some scrutiny going on. So I'll add that, Bob, and I wanted to thank you for taking the time. We're going to, in our next show, this is a 2-part show, we're going to be looking with you at director compensation. So, Bob, thanks for joining us for Executive Comp.
You're welcome.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member during this COVID-19 crisis. So we'll see you then.